Hey everybody, it's the Commodore from the Clan of the Grey Wolf, and you've caught me recovering from the food coma from Thanksgiving holiday here in the U.S. But it's time to muster up some strength to bust out this week's weekly ringer in between massive feeding sessions. Anyway, from me to you, I hope all of you had a wonderful Thanksgiving holiday, at least those of you that are celebrating in the United States. For the rest of you, maybe you got some holidays in Canada because of that. I actually heard somebody that got an additional holiday in Canada because they do business in the United States. So maybe you got a couple days off, who knows. Whether you did or whether you didn't, happy Thanksgiving to everybody out there. So, got a lot of stuff to talk about today. We had a really great discussion that really bled over into this week about mobile gaming and handheld gaming platforms. And I just thought that was a great conversation, and one that, unsurprisingly touched a nerve with a lot of you guys. And so I'm not sure I really want to go into too much of it here, but I'm glad to see that so many of you engaged so well with that content. It was a longer video than I like to make, but at the same time, there was so much to talk about, and there were so many different points to make, and I'm glad that so many of you picked up on that. And really, took the ball and ran with it, because many of you really brought in some very, very elaborate arguments, and I thought that was great. So, what are we going to do today? I might touch a little bit on that here and there, just to kind of keep that conversation going. Remember, we can always talk about these things on the forums as well. But I want to reflect on the question for Thanksgiving, which was about South Park made this parody of the History Channel, and I wanted to talk a little bit about the History Channel and what popular educational TV has really become. You guys had a lot to say about that. After I run through what many of you had in terms of contributions for the conversation around the History Channel, I'll then go into a question for next week, which talks about the launch of independent games, and I want to take a minute to think about how the market might be changing for independent games moving forward. And we all love video games, right? So that's a good thing. First things first, I want to introduce and welcome, I should say, 3 new folks to the Weekly Ringer, and maybe not necessarily new folks to the site. I always try to keep this as a separate thing. I welcome people as they come on to the Weekly Ringer. We've got 3 that I can find this week. First of all, the singularly named, and I'm sure appropriately so, Tim. Welcome, Tim, the person that wants to be known only as Tim. That takes guts. Secondly, welcome to Tim. JOMG20, now that could be Jong, or it could be JOMG. I'm trying to think of other permutations in my mind, but anyway, those are the first that come to it. Welcome, welcome, welcome. And also John C911, I think mentioned that long-time observer, first-time commenter. We love to see those. I know that there are many of you out there, and I heard from some of you this week, as a matter of fact, that just watch or listen to the Weekly Ringer and don't necessarily contribute, which is fine. We love that too. But for those of you that want to step up to the plate and throw your comments into the pile, I'm definitely very thankful to you, because that keeps this show going. All right, let's get going. So, let's talk about last week a little bit. So, there were a couple questions that came about mobile gaming. I wanted to clarify a few things. I think first that my prognosis is not that the handheld market will be gone in 5 years. My suggestion is simply to say that the way that mobile gaming has really evolved, I could definitely see in 5 years a circumstance within which there would be no need to have any kind of handheld gaming market. In which case you'd have Nintendo either trying to help really modify their business model to be a home and only home kind of business model, or, you could see them try to expand into some of the more mobile, what we now think of as the mobile handheld market. And I think both are equally plausible. My point was not to say that I predict that's what's going to happen. I think it will take longer than that, as many of you pointed out. My point is only to say that this market moves so quickly that it's entirely feasible that those things might occur. Right? Secondly, I wanted to say that there was a couple of questions. A couple of people brought up the idea that I was hacking away at Nintendo because of I was talking about their lack of innovation. I want to say that that's absolutely not the case. What I did say was that Nintendo lacks innovation. Let's put it this way. If they lack innovation anywhere, it is in the mobile gaming or the handheld gaming arena. Because I believe Nintendo's innovative quotient in many, many things has been far, far greater than almost anyone else in the industry. And I heard from many people that the fluidity of Nintendo is very important. Couldn't agree more. I think it is an important part of what they do and part of their business. The Wii itself, the whole concept of the Wii, is enough to where that made me very excited about what Nintendo's doing from an innovative standpoint. Trying to, again, and I highlighted this last week, make new experiences for video games and not just new software. And I think if we focus on that, then we realize that Nintendo is one of the greater innovators that we have around us. But not in mobile gaming. If you look in handheld gaming, traditionally they really try to ride the horses that they've already had in the stable for 10 years. That's just what they do. And I think I wanted to highlight the kind of forces and factors there. That's not to disparage Nintendo. It's just to say, in my perspective, they're going to have to find a way to push the envelope in the handheld gaming market, I guess you could say. Or else that whole business is going to go south for them, because the market is not sustainable in anything but a niche. I'm not saying it doesn't exist, but it's not sustainable in anything but a niche with all the people that are coming into mobile gaming. Anyway, we could talk about this for another hour, and I know you guys will be primed and ready for something like that. But what I wanted to do is really move on to this week's conversation about Thanksgiving and the History Channel, so on and so forth. Now, first of all, I have to say that many of you, I think, have exactly the same sentiments as me. Not a big surprise. That's one of the reasons why the Weekly Wringer works so well. You guys have a lot of the same perspectives I do. I think that's great. Some of you don't. That's okay. We love that too. So let's talk about it. South Park did I think a finger on the pulse kind of mocking of the History Channel for this year's Thanksgiving here in America. And I have to say, it touched a nerve with me because I've been the History Channel was probably my favorite channel maybe even 10 years ago. Kind of moving forward, it's hard to imagine that 10 years ago was 2001 into 2002. But in any case, it was probably my favorite channel because of all the educational content and because there really were so many interesting things to learn. I'm not saying I was using it as my primary educational vehicle. Back then I was still in school and trying to, I guess, augment with several things that I had key interest in. Something that you guys came to as well in terms of being able to augment some of the things that you were really interested in. The History Channel really fed that niche. Now, as we all know, the History Channel's moved on to more popular kinds of shows. Very similar to a lot of the educational shows. Some of the kind of more reality-based series, the Deadliest Catches of the World, the Ice Road Truckers. I'm naming every single Tom Beers show ever made. And if you don't know who Tom Beers is, basically any of the reality shows that you enjoy on any of these shows, he almost certainly started. In any case, the Tom Beers phenomenon put aside, a lot of the channels have also gone to kind of more, let's say, quick hit kind of programming, less depth. And many of you highlighted that as something that has disinterested you with the channels. But in any case, everything has really changed. And so last week I asked you about whether you still use the History Channel or any of its kind of sister channels or sister kinds of programming for educational purposes. And the response I got was fantastic. So let's jump into some of the contributions you guys gave. First of all, Tim, the enigmatically known Tim, said, quite frankly, he's not watching TV to learn. And I think that there is a good argument to be made there. Perhaps TV is just not the educational medium that everyone thought it would be. But and I think that's an interesting point. I think you could easily say with contemporary television, and I mean television now, not the things maybe you consume through your TV, but just television. I think you could say it's probably the least educational that it's ever been, to a certain degree, or maybe at least since it's the 60s, or when the networks really were free to basically do whatever they wanted to do, right? things have definitely changed, but I think that there is less educational value. And so not watching your TV to learn something, I think, is a completely appropriate response, and one that many of you echoed throughout the video. The comments about the video. Mr. K brought up some really interesting points, and I completely respect the perspective of Mr. K as a teacher too. Netflix documentaries as being a great place to go learn through the kind of, now again, that's not necessarily TV, but switching gears, you know, something like the History Channel, one of the things that was great about it were the historical documentaries. A lot of those historical documentaries are actually now on Netflix. And Mr. K is watching those along with the PBS contribution, which I thought was great, because PBS still does a lot of really cool work. The issue about PBS, obviously, is funding, and is the kind of ability they have to host content or to broadcast content that they've licensed. And a lot of times some of the more interesting and I would say educational material is stuff that doesn't necessarily come around but every once in a while. Not that PBS doesn't have great value around the clock, it absolutely does. And there are some great educational TV segments on PBS. We've talked about that on the Weekly Wringer before. When I've talked about some of my favorite, guilty pleasures of the PBS medium. In any case, I think both Netflix documentaries and PBS documentaries are probably the places that I'm going to, and I think that's a great key insight. There's one issue I want to take with Mr. K, and Mr. K, we have nothing but tremendous respect for you and your opinion. I want to say this though. The Story of Us documentary on the History Channel, I have to respectfully disagree. I thought it was an absolute abhorrent waste of time. And the reason why is precisely the reason why I cannot stand watching a lot of the History Channel shows anymore. And they mock this in the South Park episode if you've watched it. They bring on someone who has absolutely no right to talk about history, has no basis of understanding of the historical significance of events, and they sit there and talk about it as if they're on VH1's, I love the 90s, right? Let's bring in some pop culture icon who can barely spell their own name, and just because they're popular, let's have them talk about a state or a history, an element from history, and talk about the significance of it. It's like, what a complete and total waste of time. And I'm sorry, the reason I'm ranting about this is because there are so many great documentaries that the History Channel has done over the last couple of years. And I'll talk about some of those in a minute when I get to my opinion. But I just wanted to throw it out there. I thought the Story of Us was just an absolute horrible waste of time. But I think it probably did have some educational value for the classroom, hence why I respectfully disagree with Mr. K. Shirao Wolf simply told me to go read a book. And I think that's absolutely applicable today as much as it probably was before, in decades past. Let's say this. There are obviously a greater proliferation of books nowadays than there ever has been. You could make an argument that means that there's just as great or maybe a greater proliferation of misinformation as there has ever been in history as well. I agree with that. However, I think if we're looking into the kind of depth of knowledge, then books still have the greatest offering than, say, television or films or other media, for example. So if we're really interested in a conversation or an idea or a thought or a historical event, we do what many of you talked about. We jump on to some of the kind of quick hit stuff, like a TV documentary, like a Wikipedia, and now Wikipedia is also reading, by the way. But we read something on that sparks our interest. The next thing we know, there are several books because Wikipedia always has links to it. And we can go find other links to read about it, so on and on and on. And I've had many times where I've investigated something and I've started here and ended up somewhere way, way, way down the map. In the way that Wikipedia plays with our minds. But I've ended up reading books as a result of some of the things that I found on Wikipedia or that I saw in a documentary, because the documentary or the Wikipedia entry simply didn't go into the kind of depth that I was looking for. So maybe what I think several of you have mentioned is that there's a depth quotient here. As long as you're interested in kind of taking a glance at something, ancient Egypt,